but Russia, and also not so much about how World War I impacted Russian artists per se, but how, as a result, in some ways, of World War I and all of the upheavals, social, political upheavals in Europe and destruction of old empires, etc., the Bolshevik Revolution could happen, was aided by all of that unrest, obviously. And what happened with artists who were so politically committed in Russia, so engaged with society? In other words, what unifies all of these artists we've been talking about, above and beyond World War I, as you have noticed, one other important theme is that most of these artists felt that they should be politically committed, or they were reflecting upon society. In 20th century art, typically, you have, on the one hand, this insistence on purity of art, and art as being completely detached from social concerns. And in some ways, the push towards abstraction at the beginning of the 20th century, as exemplified by the works of Kandinsky, Malevich, who we will talk about, and also Mondrian, those three major abstract artists, or non-objective in some cases. The push towards abstraction was driven by a desire to create a world of art which is autonomous from our world in general, non-referential, art that exists as some kind of entity above this world that doesn't relate to this world, but relates to human experience, or a way of understanding the world through purely abstract means. And as Piet Mondrian said at one point in one of his theoretical texts, they were searching for a new plastic reality. And what they meant by plastic was not plastic the way we commonly use it, but plastic as a reality of forms and shapes. Forms and shapes, and they somehow relate to the world, but they don't replicate the world, they don't reference it directly, they exist on a different plane. So on the one hand, you have these people who are interested in autonomy or freedom of art. On the other hand, you have the socially engaged, politically committed people. And you will see most of the artists we talked about until now were somehow socially engaged because they spoke about the war, and even the Dadaists. But in the Russian case, you have artists who started out by being purists, by trying to create an artistic reality separate from our reality. And then you have artists who really put their art in service of the political ideology of the time. And then, of course, they got disillusioned with the ideology in many cases. So it's a very interesting parallel development. But I'm showing you here, I'm showing you a painting that is probably twice its real size, but the painting itself is still rather large scale. And I saw this a couple of years ago in an exhibition in Europe, in Italy, I believe. I was fortunate to be there at that moment. It was an exhibition about Russian art right before World War I, and it was about connections between Russian art and non-European traditions, because there was this whole interest among avant-garde artists in Russia in, ancient rites and rituals in Siberia, in connecting with Asian cultures. On the one hand, Russians, of course, always felt like the backwater of Europe and tried to catch up, all that complex inferiority vis-à-vis the French and the amassing of great collections of Western masterpieces, right, since Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. But at the same time, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were all these artists who said, let's look for the indigenous cultures. And they tried to create a new visual language which looked both very modern and also Asian, and also vernacular, folkloric. And I just wanted to show you this painting because I had never seen anything like it. It's painted in 1909, and it's not easily placeable. It's not easily placeable in any movement. I mean, to my mind, you could paint this today. It could be a contemporary abstract painting. The artist I had never heard of. So the artist is Vladimir Baroque. And then I read about him, and there wasn't much. And I have found 3 or 4 other paintings by him. And this one was known Primavera. Yeah, 1910. And what I love about it is how incredibly free of all influences it seems to be at this particular moment, because, you know, people are working on cubism, people are interested in Fauvism. Matisse, by the way, was somebody that the Russian avant-garde was familiar with, because there were some major collectors in Russia who acquired Matisse, Cézanne, early Picassos, Shchukin and Morozov. They were these 2 major collectors whose works ended up being expropriated in the end by the state, of course. But Baroque was one of these completely unknown people to me, and he still remains very obscure. And, well, the reason for that is he was born in 1886 and died on the Salonika front in 1917. So he just started to paint. He came up with this very original visual language. And this is, yeah, just a little sort of ink drawing from 1913 that I wanted to show you because, while it's not a great work of art, it tells you that, like many other artists of the period, he is interested in the primitive, in the essential, in the fundamental, kind of like extremely simplified, almost like ancient, right? Like some kind of thing from a wall painting or something done by a little child. I mean, like essentialist, this language of Marx. So Baroque, he had a brother apparently, David Baroque, who I read about later on, who settled in Connecticut, and he was active until the 60s or 70s in America, but he never made it as an artist. And that's another very interesting thing about Russian artists. Many of them who fled the Soviet Union in one form or another and ended up in France, many of them in Paris, then in England, in the States, in Italy, some of them. What's interesting about them is that they really never made it once they were outside, with some rare exceptions. So those who remained suffered tremendously, or they were co-opted. They had to be transformed artistically after Stalinism came into power. And those who left continued to work, but they had to become more market-oriented, and they lost the edge. They lost that initial creative urge that they had when they were working in the teens. So Baroque is one of those unknowns. And I started with an unknown because there are still many unknowns associated with the Russian avant-garde. Because we have to keep in mind that after the consolidation of the communists in the late 20s, early 30s, when all of these avant-garde manners became undesirable and socialist realism was pushed as the only proper way of making art for the masses, for the people, these artists could no longer exhibit in many cases. They had to change their styles. Some of them ended up in gulags, ended up getting killed. Some of them committed suicide. And most of their works were also buried. The way the Nazis dealt with the sort of degenerate art of the German expressionists, similar thing was done in the Soviet Union with these avant-garde artists. So they were slowly rediscovered in the 70s and 80s in various depots in the Soviet Union. And some of the best collections are brought abroad, are Stedelijk in Amsterdam, which has a wonderful collection of Malevich paintings. Then I was very surprised, Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid has a marvelous collection of Russian constructivist art and Russian abstract art, but there are like few isolated spots where Western collectors really collected. And strangely enough, a Greek consular officer stationed in Moscow for a long time in the 60s and 70s was able to buy a lot of avant-garde art. And of all things, you would be surprised, in Thessaloniki, in northern Greece, there is a museum dedicated to Russian avant-garde art based on the works of art that this collector acquired. So it's still terra incognita. There are many things we can learn about these people. But now I'm going to go to the famous guy. We all know Vasily Kandinsky, and the reason we know Kandinsky, of course, is that he was one of these people, almost a nomad. I mean, he was traveling. He was living in Western Europe. He was born in Moscow 1866, and he's much older than Bourliuk's generation. Died in 1944 in France. And Vasily Kandinsky is considered today as the father of abstract art in a certain way. We all know that. But it is worth remembering when you look at Kandinsky and when you look at a painting like that from around 1910, it looks like a number of images I showed you earlier associated with the German expressionists, especially people like Franz Marc, the Blau Reiter group in Germany, the Baroque group, 1905, 1906. So Kandinsky doesn't work in isolation. Nobody does. And Kandinsky is talking to his other artists, and he's also interested in the same issues of the spiritual in art. I already mentioned this is called composition number 4 from 1911. And I have here a subtitle, Kandinsky and Music. I already talked about all this interest in music and tonality and dissonance, assonance, and clashing sounds. And Kandinsky, after a while, from around 1910, stopped giving names to his paintings and just called them composition and then improvisation. There is a whole series. And the reason is that he was very, very fascinated by the emotional power of music. And because music expresses itself through sound and time, again, the question of time is so central to these people. It allows also freedom of imagination, interpretation, and emotional response, not based on literal or the descriptive, but on the abstract quality. And this is why he felt that paintings can no longer be representational. They shouldn't describe. Rather, paintings should express your state as you encounter the world. So it's highly subjective rather than objective. Impressionists were trying to capture the world as it appeared in front of the eye at 5 o'clock in the afternoon as you observe the mountain or the cathedral. But there is a certain desire for objectivity in Impressionism. They were trying to be scientists. These guys were trying to be symbolists, trying to capture what goes on in the soul and how is that being conveyed through color and form. So that's Kandinsky for your typical composition. And you can see that as you analyze these, there are forms that look like something you can find in the world. Maybe a mountain, maybe trees, maybe a road, maybe a boat. But it's all about maybe. It's all about maybe, and it's all about freedom of interpretation. So like you look at it and you try to wonder. So it's more like the song of the artist or a poem in which you can just kind of capture some allusions, and you can then go on with that and fill in the blanks, and you finish the painting through your own improvisation, because it's very much about emotions. So, just wanted to highlight a few other things about Kandinsky and music. He was also very interested, but many other people were, in this concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, or the complete work of art. In other words, a work of art that doesn't appeal just to one sense, but this kind of multi-sensory experience. In many ways, what Kandinsky was doing and his buddies around 1911 corresponds to how artists today are interested in these immersive environments and installations where you have sound and smell and color and, and your own experience as a human body walking through this space. So they were interested in that kind of immersive environment, but through painting. And they were also interested, which I don't have written here, he was interested also very much in synesthesia. And synesthesia is that sort of neurological phenomenon, right? Where you essentially see a sign, and the sign, even though it says number 4, you see number 4 as being yellow or red. You have crossing over, basically, in your sensory experience. You kind of hear music and you see colors, and vice versa. You look at colors and you hear tones. Actually, I've had some students who have told me they have synesthesia as a condition. So Kandinsky may have had that kind of condition himself, but many artists were interested in that kind of crossing over from one sensory experience to another in order to create a more complete representation of how we respond to the world. So music can respond and appeal directly to the artist's internal element. And yes, spirituality. These guys were living at a moment in which the very idea of God was being questioned. I mean, Nietzsche, who died in 1900, Friedrich Nietzsche had said that God was dead. There was no God. And obviously nobody was boldly coming out saying all these things per se, but you had, after Darwin, there were all kinds of question marks about where is God, who is God, how are we related to everybody else, etc., which God, right? So they were living in a world in which they were questioning all these established values, but they wanted something bigger than themselves, meaning. So they wanted to create a new spiritual. And they actually believed that art was a way of becoming spiritual. And it can convert us into better versions of ourselves. So, for example, he also wrote on stage composition, he wrote a play, Yellow Sound, and then he had these poems called Klanga, just sounds. When you read them, you're supposed to hear sounds. All of these ideas about mixing things so we can get a more comprehensive understanding, grasp. And that's one of the images from the sounds. You see, this compilation of poems, sound poems, Klanga, was published in Munich in 1912. And it was a wonderful example of an artist's book because it had poems and woodcuts, like two parallel strands. So words and images working next to one another, and then also evoking sounds. And then, of course, he also published the most important one by Kandinsky, Concerning the Spiritual in Art. The Blaureiter Almanac was a journal that he co-edited with Franz Marc. But Concerning the Spiritual in Art, in 1911, you can find it online completely, is his treatise on what is abstract art. And all of these correspondences between colors and sounds and why it is so important for our spiritual renewal. So, he's the most famous one, but these kind of spiritual tendencies were shared by his fellow artists back in Russia. He was at this time in Germany, but here is a woman, Natalia Goncharova, one of those who actually lived until 1962. She didn't suffer, as dramatically as some of the other people. Yes, she did. She couldn't show her work for a long time. And then she was born in 1881, and what you see here is the Annunciation from 1909. She started out by painting these images that are inspired by the Russian icon tradition. And of course, I want to bring in the icons because Russians are the largest group of the Slavic people who are Eastern Rite Christians or Orthodox Christians, right? I came from a country where my part of the country was also Orthodox Christian, and culturally. And what has happened throughout history is that Orthodoxy is always seen as, it is schismatic vis-a-vis the Catholics. They separated from the Catholic Church back in the 11th century. A number of Slavic groups accepted Orthodoxy, but Orthodoxy is characterized by a degree of mysticism and by this business of, so instead of explaining what's going on, even though The actual Eucharist ceremony and the entire service is done in the vernacular, in Church Slavonic. There is a great emphasis on mystery in Orthodox churches, if you've ever experienced an Orthodox service. So they stand, and there is an awful lot of kind of murkiness in the church, and then you have all these nice, interesting smells and lights, and you know, you're never supposed to be able to explain what goes on. Catholics have some of that. Protestants are the most explanatory, of course, among the Christian churches. But Orthodoxy is seen always as this somewhat Eastern affected, right, form of Christianity. And when she goes to the tradition of icon painting, obviously she makes it very avant-garde, very modern. This is the scene of the Annunciation. But she's trying to merge what is Western idea of painting, these new interesting bold, bright colors, cubism, this nice angular composition, very modernist, flattened. She tries to merge that with the Orthodox iconography and also with the notion that icons themselves, if you've seen Russian icons, I know all of us have seen them, you know that you've seen one, you've seen them all, correct? Many people find them rather unexciting because they feel so repetitive. But I just want to make one comment about why Russian icons are so repetitive. Because in the Orthodox theory of image, you do not paint God and holy beings or any other holy subject as something that belongs to our world. It's much closer in some ways to Buddhism and extreme stylization. You're supposed to create an ideal image and then replicate that image to infinity. And if you become too real, you are producing idols and you're engaging in idolatry. So they really despise the Catholic emphasis on extreme realism. You want to be distant because your works are about painting the supernatural. And the supernatural is ideal. It will never change. So you have one ideal image of Christ, one ideal image of Virgin Mary, and that's it. This is why it never evolved. So there is a huge gap between the icon painting tradition in the 13th, 14th, 15th century in Russia and the introduction of modern art, because they were constantly just repeating in this context of the icon painting. So what Goncharova is trying to do is she's saying, I'm going back to the repetitive, simple, stylized, abstract language of Russian icons, and I'm proving that it is actually very modern because it can be blended very easily with the most modern tendencies coming out from France, which is the flat painting, abstraction, geometry, and all that. Does that make sense? So that's what she's doing here. And of course, she had a husband, and they were kind of like the Dadaists. They were very funny, Goncharova and Mikhail Larionov. So once again, we're talking about elitists, people who were from the right circles. And you can see Larionov here with some kind of temporary tattoos drawing on his face. They, by the way, lived together for decades as an unmarried couple. They were rather unconventional. And yes, they finally married in '95 only to ensure that whoever survived the other could inherit the paintings. So they would paint on their own and their friends' bodies images or offensive words or phrases and parade through the wealthiest parts of the city or sit in cafes with insulting mottos and messages on their faces. So they were iconoclasts. They tried to shock. So there were plenty of these people living in Russia as well before the revolution. And what's really interesting in the Russian context, however backward Russia may have appeared to some Westerners, there were lots of women in the avant-garde circles. There was recently even a whole exhibition called The Amazons of the Avant-Garde about all the Russian women artists of the teens. They were taken seriously. And yes, they were very interested in Russia's connection to Byzantine and Asian cultures. And they collected Japanese prints and Chinese prints, which explains that Burliuk Primavera, the pink painting I started with. So there were all kinds of currents happening in Russia. How did Larionov paint her husband? This is a Rayonist composition. This is at the MoMA in New York from 1913. MoMA has a nice little collection of Russian avant-garde because one of the curators there is very, very interested in this period, so she's trying to collect more. But what does this look like? Vaguely like the futurist compositions we talked about. But it's not really futurist because you see everybody around 1910 in Europe was saying, I'm the first abstract painter, I'm the first cubist, I invented a new movement, right? We talked about vorticists, futurists, cubism, and Russians said, well, we'll call ourselves Rayonists. So that's their own brand of modernity. And Rayonist, as you can imagine from the word itself, it's about forms that project energy in all directions, almost like rays, right? Forms that go in all kinds of, you see, diagonals. And diagonals are super important because, of course, every time you paint in with lots of diagonals in a composition, you create compositions that tend to escape beyond the boundaries of the frame. Diagonal is the best way to create a dynamic composition, as we know. And you can see that this is what Larionov exactly is doing. Just this web of lines, very strong, energetic, with rather strong clashing colors. And this idea that the picture is not being held by the frame, that this composition could push way beyond. And that's, by the way, something that will be interesting. I mean, we saw actually that already in Burliuk, in that Primavera, the big diagonal, the sort of branch against that pink backdrop. So they're all interested in how can I go beyond the frame, and that's part of the business of immersive experience. Even though it's just a painting, it's supposed to convey something much larger than itself. Here is Goncharova. Look at that. Pretty neat. Cyclist, 1913. As avant-garde as anything that could have been painted anywhere in like France, in Paris, or in Munich, or in London. And once again, you see, I mean, before internet, before mass communication, before readily available photographs, when letters traveled for a long time, imagine how quickly these artists saw each other's work. Okay, Goncharova had traveled to Paris. She had been exposed to those currents. But still, there is an awful lot of coincidence happening in Europe around 1913, 1914, simultaneity in this avant-garde, rather than a single center. And once more, the idea of letters and numbers, and letters that mean something versus letters that just suggest part of a word, the aesthetic of collage that we talked about yesterday in conjunction with Dada. So, and of course, obsession with time and movement, like the futurists. We exist, but we exist only as time, as process. That's the only way you can paint this modern world. So that leads me to the most radical one. We talked about emotion. We talked about Byzantine icons a little bit and how important Byzantine icons were for Russian artists like Goncharova and others. But you probably know when you see a black square that this is going to be about Kazimir Malevich, the most radical of abstract painters in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Probably, yeah, the most sort of unconventional thinker among abstract artists. He talked about something called the supremacy of pure feeling. Pure feeling. It's not about thought. It's not about ideas. It's about intuitive grasp of the world and mystical grasp of the world. Once again, that business of the Russian mysticism, right? The orthodoxy. Well, he painted pictures such as this, the black square. What you see is what you see. Is there a story? No, God forbid. No words should try to describe what goes on here. The problem with Malevich, unfortunately, is that he used media that were not so high quality. in ideal conditions, this should be very, very perfect black. This should be like something that looks like it was never touched by a human hand. That's the whole idea, because Byzantine icons were also, according to Byzantine theology of image, intended to be as almost like images that, you know, God sends you a signal, you are just the hand of God. As an artist, you paint the icon, you never sign yourself. In Byzantine art, there are very few signatures, right? And the whole idea is that you're just a pure vehicle of God, and you should not be present in your image. You're just the hand that executes. So you're not supposed to be there as a subjective genius artist or anything like that. So Malevich saw himself in a strange way as somebody who is analogous to this ancient process. Like, I'm creating paintings that come into being by themselves because of some spiritual laws. But he started out, let me just go back. He started out, his particular brand, of course, of abstraction was called Suprematism, supremacy of pure feeling. The painting which is supreme above everything else, stands above the world. 1878 to 1935, from Kiev, then he ended up in Leningrad, where he died. When you see Malevich early on in this self-portrait from about 1906, he could be like proto-German expressionist as well, like some of the painters we looked at before. He was also interested, just like Kandinsky, in clashing colors, strong primaries, like all of these painters influenced by symbolism after Van Gogh, right? And Munch and Gauguin, all of the painters who went for these bright, strong colors in order to speak about emotion. So there is an early self-portrait with a female nude behind, a female nude being always sort of suggestive of the classical subject matter. Every time you see a female nude in an artist studio, it's supposed to tell you this is an artist who is in search for the perfect beauty. Because the female nude was seen as the archetypal model in the studio. But this one is rather, I don't know, I cannot quite read it, but you can see that it's a female nude there placed like a model behind the artist. And it has this very, very vibrant red, but gets almost lost against the rest of the background. So that's just a photograph of him. And then these are just a couple of things that I wanted to mention about him, that he studied at the Moscow School of Painting, that there he was influenced by Larionov and Goncharova, the couple we talked about, joined various avant-garde exhibitions. He too traveled to Paris, and then invented Suprematism in 1915 and wrote a manifesto. And then he taught at various art schools, and then published another very important treatise called The World as Non-Objectivity. This was published in Munich in 1926. After the revolution, it already became a little iffy as to how do we publish these theoretical treatises about pure art, because pure art was no longer something that was advocated by the regime. And then this was his last large traveling retrospective in Berlin, Warsaw, Munich in 1927. He returns, and of course, after his return, he is no longer desirable. Many of his works are confiscated. He is banned from creating and exhibiting avant-garde. He dies of cancer in 1935. On his deathbed, he was exhibited with the black square above him. That was his icon. That was his religious painting. Black is the ultimate nothing, is the ultimate absence, is before the world becomes visible. The black square for him was this sort of very primal, original image, the original black in a white frame. And that's what he chose to have, presumably, which is why his students put that over his deathbed. So, and then a white cube decorated with a black square was placed on his tomb. This was important to them. They were willing to go to jail for the kind of art they created. So there was a lot at stake in this non-objective abstraction theories. Because, as I said, they were looking for alternative to conventional religion. So they thought art was going to take them there. So, early works by Malevich, before he invented Suprematism, here is a very wild, very aggressive, very sort of uncouth, extremely inept almost painting. Something that looks expressionist, something that looks, once again, primitive. And you remember that drawing of the woman by Bourliuk I showed you earlier? That strange body, kind of deformed body. Similar visual language. But you see the appearance of the strong colors and breaking up of the surface and sort of this interest to paint something that's both abstract, purely abstract, gestural, and something that still looks like a human being. And then he rapidly evolves and things become ever simpler and more controlled. So the human figures are still there. And here is a woodcutter, peasant, and oh, sorry, on the back of the painting, it's peasant women in church. This is from 1912, and this is from Stedelijk in Amsterdam, the place that has a lot of Malevich. So you can see how this is both real and utterly abstract. It's trying to find a new universal language of art, like Kandinsky, a little bit of a boat, a little bit of a sea, a little bit of pure color. More wanderings, experiments on the part of Malevich, words and images working together, visual poems. The whole idea of čas means hour, ta, whatever ta means, zatmenje can mean, I read some Russian, darkening. There is a church here, there is a human figure, a fish, a candle, collage. Disconnected fragments of reality. Prior to Dada, 1914. Skakvoje общество. Общество means society. What kind of society, it says there. So just little bit of messages, mixed messages thrown in. And this is a suprematist composition in 1917, one of those pure emotion paintings, and you will see that in a lot of these paintings by Malevich, things go at diagonal. Things go in unpredictable ways and tend to go in a centrifugal motion away from the center towards the edges and trying to escape the frame of the composition. But then he would do things such as, just like the black square, this black circle, 1913, painted in 1915. You know what that is about? They were constantly fighting. Who is going to be the first one? So they sometimes faked their own dates. So people have established that this was painted in 1915, but he signed it then 1913 to show the audience, look, I thought of suprematism 2 years ago. It was all about originality. So this is how he describes suprematism, the new art which has produced new forms and form relationships by giving external expressions to pictorial feeling will become a new architecture. It will transfer these forms from the surface of canvas to pure space, from the surface of canvas to space, and oftentimes in these suprematist compositions there is no perfect symmetry. The circle is off, enough off that it feels to be kind of temporarily imprisoned by the frame. But this is the way in which that black circle is going to fly off from the square and become part of space as a new art reality. It's strange theories, very difficult to understand, even by the scholars of suprematism, very complicated. So, he also called it non-objective feeling, because non-objective, he said, I'm not an abstract painter. Kandinsky is an abstract painter. He starts from real, goes to abstraction. I'm doing something which has nothing to do with objects. So the painting for him was non-objective. And also about this pure feeling idea. And he said, the square is the feeling, the white field is the void beyond the feeling. And then you have white on white in 1918. And then he was also very, very interested in non-Euclidean geometry, not 3 dimensions, but 4 dimensions. The whole idea of the fact that these forms themselves should be seen, even though they're so simple, even when you have just a single white square tilted and walking away, flying off, or this circle about to fly off from the frame. It's about forms through time, and which of course leads us to the idea of the mysticism and the 4th dimension and this kind of superior understanding of reality that goes to some kind of new spiritual. He wrote his text, Non-Objective World, once again, published it in Munich in 1927. You can also access that online, download it, but it's hardly comprehensible, hardly comprehensible. By 1923, Malevich was also co-opted, like most other artists working in the new Soviet Union. He was kind of asked by the government, encouraged in a sense, to produce works of art for mass audiences. Because the point about Russian avant-garde is that they were not supposed anymore to create works of art just for museums. If you were a real believer in progress, you were supposed to create workers' uniforms that are avant-garde. Teapots and cups and saucers and everything to be part of this new aesthetic, new modernity, and therefore transformation of society, comprehensive transformation of society. When people no longer look at their plates and see beautiful flowers, but see Malevich's suprematist compositions, they will become more educated, enlightened. And if you look at all these modern objects around you, your entire worldview is going to change. Well, we still believe in that, right? When we surround ourselves with objects that express certain aesthetic, it affects your spirit. So this was part of the program of the Bolsheviks, to harness the potential of the avant-garde and to use their creativity for these utilitarian objects. So this is in the State Porcelain Factory that he makes these suprematist plates and cups and saucers. But then he was no longer in favor, as we said, and this was actually a photograph, a rare photograph, which shows his last retrospective exhibition since the October Revolution in 1932. And there is Malevich surrounded by these suprematist paintings. The suprematist paintings are very, very modest in scale. You see them on these big slides, but they actually are very modest because obviously there is a limit to what he could do and materials, and which is why it was so important for him to paint the so-called infinity within a simple frame.
Would this be in Russia?
This was in Russia in 1932, but it was a semi-formal exhibition. It wasn't a major exhibition. This was in his studio.
How are these people making money now? Are they exhibiting?
How are these people making money now? Are they exhibiting? Russian avant-garde art has gone through the roof. It's extremely collectible, very expensive at auction houses. At the time, God knows how they were making money. They were not. They were not. They basically, you either painted your workers, you know, in the field, or you basically lived in a shared apartment with 6 other families and got a tiny bit of money to buy soup. I don't know. I mean, it was not easy, not easy. Or you ended up in Gulag, right? No, it was a very, very tragic situation with the Russian avant-garde. And basically, around 1933, Malevich goes back to figuration. And many people have said that he sold out, that under the pressures of the regime, he went back to figures rather than maintain that pure abstraction. But when you look at this picture, the running man, hint, hint, I mean, there he is, completely abstract figure running off, and usually in Western art, you go from left to right. That signifies movement and progress, how we read texts. This guy is running back to something, to something. And there is a red cross, but the cross is red. So what's going on in here? the peasant running back, and the red cross behind him, and another cross that looks like a sword. But you could not do political painting, seriously political painting during Stalinism without getting instantly punished. Although artists were less punished than poets and writers, because words, no matter how elusive and indirect they are, they attack much more clearly. Whereas art can play these games so you can interpret it any which way without ending up in jail. So this is sort of an ironic, if you will, self-portrait from 1933. At the height of Stalinism, he also goes back, as we say, to figuration, to the figurative. But I think there is something rather defiant. On the one hand, he says, okay, you want me to be realistic, so I'll go back to the Renaissance and paint myself like Holbein self-portrait, right? At the same time, you have this bright red and green and that abstract field behind him. So he's trying to tell people, I'm not leaving abstraction behind. So now I'm going to talk briefly, just as a counterpart to Malevich, about somebody else who seems to have embraced the ideology of socialist realism and the whole idea that all art has to be in service of society much more readily than Malevich. And his motto was not the old, not the new, but the necessary. This person was Alexander Rodchenko. This guy. 1891 to 1956. So yes, he was part of the avant-garde, and then in 1921, after the revolution, he denounced on ideological grounds, meaning because he was so much embracing this new ideology of communism they were creating, he denounced easel painting as bourgeois. Why do we need easel painting? Who needs easel painting anymore? And became exponent of productivism. Productivism meaning you will create posters, you will create furniture, photography, film, you will do designs, as I said, for workers' uniforms. The entire world has to change. Artists are producers. Artists can no longer sit in their studios. They have to go with the factory workers and produce useful things. So not the old, not the new, but what is necessary to build a new world. That's how he felt. Then he began painting again in his later years. And then, yes, he tried very much to reject the conventional roles of self-expression, personal handling of the medium, and to create tasteful or aesthetic objects. Because he said, this is not about me. This is about the world we are creating. So forget about my identity as an artist. So many people say that because he rejected art so adamantly, one could compare him to the Dadaists, but it's a slightly different story because he did it for the sake of a new world rather than the Dadaists just destroying the world. So this is a spatial construction made of plywood at the MoMA. It's about creating things that in an abstract way epitomize modernity, contemporary reality. It's about creating things that are never perfect circles, they're ovoid shapes, these spatial constructions. They seem slightly unstable, they're not symmetrical, they're moving the way the circles and the squares in Malevich move. So it's about forms in constant movement. A lot of Rodchenko's constructivist compositions were intended as some kind of demonstration of perpetual movement. So when you look at that spatial construction or this one, you can see them hanging from an invisible thread, and they're almost like Calder's mobiles, but they're intended to speak about this incessant movement and progress. And geometry for them, of course, is progress. Pivoting, rotating when they're suspended. Planetary orbits, again, small scale, but conveying something much bigger than itself, very ambitious. Many of these objects were destroyed and they have been reconstructed by museums so that we can see what these artists intended to show us. He had a wife who was also a talented artist, Varvara Stepanovna. This is a picture of the two of them, and this is her own avant-garde experiment, dancing figures, once again like the Futurists movement, 1920. And then this was that major exhibition, 5 by 5 equals 25, is what the painting says. It was a 2-part abstract exhibition in 1921. There were 5 artists. Look at this, couple of women, Alexandra Ekster, Lyubov Popova, Varvara Stepanovna, 3 women in this radical exhibition, Alexander Rodchenko and another artist, Vesnin. And essentially, they said that their exhibition was going to be the end of art. This was the end of art as we know it. So they didn't care about expressionism and emotion and anxiety and anguish. And Rodchenko, for example, presented at this exhibition 3 canvases, 3 canvases of a single color, red, yellow, and blue. And he said that this was essentially the last painting created, red, yellow, and blue. The 3 basic colors. And by the way, I mean, people like Frank Stella in America in the 60s who created this purely like blue surface, red surface, the minimalists of the 60s and 70s, especially in American art, when they discovered these Russians, they were shocked that somebody had actually painted like this in 1921. They thought they were the first ones to come up with the idea of, here is the pure blue. Yves Klein in France with pure blue, you know, but they were completely shocked when these things came out eventually. Because even though Rodchenko was champion of the system, these things were not shown in the Soviet Union afterwards. This was possible in 21, but by the time Stalin consolidated power, it was all undercover, basically. So he was too betrayed, just like everyone else. Yes?
Sorry, Aneta, how did Rodchenko manage to continue this art during a world war?
Ooh, by making works on commission, by becoming a photographer, by documenting, by making movies, by making propaganda for the workers. No. So he played that game. He actually believed still in that ideology, and he couldn't understand why his radical experiments in abstraction can no longer be shown. And this is Textile Design by his wife in 24. And you were supposed to go to a store in Moscow and Leningrad if you were a regular person and buy this and sew yourself a dress. Because that would make you like, you know, modern person. It's lovely, but it's difficult to imagine wearing it, even today. So anyway, this is what he did. He did posters. This is how he survived. That's how I wanted to conclude, to essentially tell you that, yes, somebody like Malevich was lucky enough to die of cancer in 35. Rodchenko continued to work, to be a producer, to make posters. This was a propaganda movie, The Battleship Potemkin. Was intended by Sergei Eisenstein, that great classic movie, The Battleship Potemkin, created in 1926, was intended to be a movie for the workers. And what was really funny is, now it's considered one of the classics of the avant-garde in cinema. The workers were all taken en masse to the cinema and they didn't like it. It was too modern. It was a failure, commercial failure completely. But who cared about commercial failure in Soviet Union, right? That didn't matter. As long as you push the workers to watch it, that's fine. Then the movie became popular in the West because of its avant-garde tendencies. And then it was brought back to Russia and became a little bit more popular, Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin. But that was a poster by Rodchenko. So that's what he did. And he did posters such as this beautiful collage that he did, an illustration for a poem by Vladimir Mayakovsky in 1923, one of the great Russian poets of the avant-garde. So you see, you could continue for a while doing this kind of avant-garde work as long as you manage to frame it properly, whether it's for the movie that will be shown.